Imagine, just imagine, if you will, being an Australian neuroscientist at the beginning of the 20th century. You would have been isolated by thousands of kilometers from the great overseas centers of science. The historian, Geoffrey Blainey, famously called this isolation the tyranny of distance. And this is my faded and stained copy of his book, which I purchased in Oxford some 55 years ago when I was deciding whether to emigrate to Australia. Leaving aside access to equipment and supplies, just consider the communication difficulties posed by the tyranny of distance. Sea mail to Europe became possible in 1810, and from the 1850s you could voyage in person, but a round trip by sea could take several months depending on schedules and weather. That is, if you had the fortitude and the stomach to sail in a wind-assisted steamer, such as this one, departing Port Melbourne. In the 1920s, an airmail connection to Europe was established, and by the 1930s you could fly as a passenger. That is, if you were rich enough, but even flying could take a week because of multiple stops for refuelling and connections. There were no air bridges for these intrepid travellers, but at least they could chat to the pilot and sample the fumes of the refueler. As for overcoming the tyranny of distance by telephone, by the 1880s you could talk locally on an analogue system that consisted of a microphone and a loudspeaker and a human operator to make the connections. From 1910 onwards, trunk lines connected the capital cities of Australia, but required whole banks of operators, such as this one in Melbourne that was somewhat lacking in gender diversity, witness the astounding males lurking on the left. By the 1930s, overseas calls became possible, albeit by crackling shortwave radio, but it was not until the 1990s that digital technology, submarine cables and satellites made it possible to overcome. It will therefore come as no surprise that nearly all the early Australasian neuroscience pioneers that I will discuss today went overseas for some, if not all, of their careers, including my first pioneer, Laura Foster. Laura Foster was born in Sydney in 1858 and died in tragic circumstances in Russia in 1917. She was the fifth of 11 children of the Premier of New South Wales, William Foster. In 1880, she went to Switzerland to study medicine at the prestigious University of Bern. After graduating, she spent the next 5 years at the Institute of Pathology in Bern. In 1990, she moved to Oxford, where she established a medical practice. In this unprepossessing building, the wheelie bins in front are a more modern addition. She also continued her research on muscle spindle development at the University Laboratory of Physiology, where she published a Journal of Physiology paper entitled Notes on Fetal Muscle Spindles. In 1911, Laura Foster visited the laboratory of Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who 5 years earlier had been awarded the Nobel Prize. Cajal's laboratory was in a modest building in a quiet, tree-lined street of Madrid. Foster was only there for a few months, and this in fact may be her in the left foreground. At Cajal's suggestion, she repeated his mammalian work on spinal trauma, but in birds, demonstrating identical changes. In this figure, damaged axons on the left have formed degenerative balls labelled C, D, E, and F, whereas other axons on the right have sprouted regenerative processes. Her paper, published in an obscure Spanish journal with her name misspelt, would have been forgotten if Cajal and his colleagues had not frequently cited it in their own papers. Laura Foster's other neuroscience interest was ovarian function in mental disease, for which purpose she examined the ovaries of over 100 women who had died in London mental asylums. In this work she was guided by Gustav Mann, who was the founder of physiological histology. This example is labelled from a 25-year-old congenital imbecile showing connective tissue proliferation around a degenerating ovum and formation of corpus luteum spurium. In 1912, at the outbreak of war in the Balkans, she abandoned her scientific career and her medical career to join the British Army as a nurse because they did not send women doctors to the front. Tragically, she died on the Russian front in 1917, exhausted by the stress of constant bombardment and exposure to infections. Her ovarian research was published posthumously in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Medicine as Histological Examination of the Ovaries in Mental Disease by the late Laura Forster. What was Laura Forster like? I could find little personal information about her, but her life choices speak of exceptional determination and courage. A future ANS prize in her name is surely overdue. My next pioneer, James Wilson, was a contemporary of Forster. James Wilson was born in Scotland in 1861 and died in England in 1945. He graduated from the University of Edinburgh in medicine in 1883, and after a spell as a ship's doctor, he was appointed demonstrator in anatomy at the Sydney Medical School in 1887. In 1889, he published in the Journal of Anatomy and Physiology what I believe to be the very first Australian neuroscience paper. It was entitled Abnormal Distribution of the Nerve to the Quadratus Femoris in Man, with remarks on its significance. In it, he fancifully surmised that it was an abnormality of limb innervation that resembled a marsupial pattern. Nothing came of it. Nevertheless, it was a prelude to the comparative research that was to bring him fame later. That same year, Wilson was appointed Professor of Anatomy at the Sydney University, where he established the eponymous museum that is still in use today. For the next 30 years, he ran an ever-expanding department, all the while feuding constantly with the Dean, Anderson Stewart. As a former Dean, I empathised with Stewart. It was said that, quote, whereas Anderson Stewart built the Sydney Medical School, it was Wilson who furnished it, that is, furnished it with a research reputation. Eventually, in 1920, Wilson returned reluctantly to the United Kingdom as the Professor of Anatomy at Cambridge University. Wilson had developed his reputation by researching the comparative anatomy of native fauna. He did so with a small interdisciplinary group of young scientists, including James Hill and Elliot Smith, who were known collectively as the Duckmalloy Fraternity, after the Blue Mountains River, where they obtained their specimen. Here are the intrepid trio outside their field laboratory, and here they are on the banks of the Duckmalloy River hunting for platypus. As his photos suggest, Wilson was an austere persona and was considered somewhat humorless and a dull lecturer. But in research, his enthusiasm was irresistible, and his devotion to his protégés was legendary. One of his protégés, Elliot Smith, is our next pioneer. Elliot Smith was born in Grafton, New South Wales in 1871 and died in the United Kingdom in 1937. He studied medicine at Sydney University, where he completed an MD thesis under Wilson on the neuroanatomy of monotremes. In 1896, he won a scholarship to St John's College, Cambridge, where he published several papers on neuroanatomical topics. 4 years later, he was appointed Professor of Anatomy at the Government Medical School in Cairo, where he became immersed in studies of Egyptian mummies and cortical anatomy. His book on the tomb of Tutankhamun became a bestseller, and he also produced a topographical map of the human cerebral cortex, seen here in both medial and cross-section, which he achieved by the remarkable feat of cutting fresh brain sections by hand with a scalpel and examining them unstained using a handheld magnifying lens. He later upgraded to a monocular microscope. Elliot Smith was appointed Professor of Anatomy at Manchester University in 1909. There he continued his studies on mummies and revolutionized the teaching of anatomy using clinical methods to demonstrate living anatomy. 10 years later, he was appointed Professor of Anatomy at University College London, where he became famous for a series of books on the search for man's ancestors, which he argued originated in Europe, Egyptology and the diffusion of culture, which he argued became the basis of all civilizations, and the evolution of the dragon, which he claimed was the basis of all religions. Subsequently, all of these wide-ranging claims were demolished, but at the time they made him famous. More enduring was his legacy as a mentor to some 20 protégés, whom he dispatched to chairs of anatomy all over the world, including an Australian, Raymond Dart, to whom I shall return. What was Elliot Smith like as a person? He was said to have the smile of a schoolboy and the appearance of a benevolent dignitary of the church. Genial in social intercourse, but in debating and writing on controversial topics, his gentleness forsook him. The ANS Sir Grafton Elliot Smith Award is given annually for the best poster presented by a student member. My next pioneer, Alfred Campbell, was a contemporary of Elliot Smith. Alfred Campbell was born in rural New South Wales in 1868 and died in Sydney in 1937. In 1889, he graduated in medicine in Edinburgh and then toured centres of neurology in London, Vienna and Prague. 3 years later, he completed his MD thesis on the pathology of alcoholic insanity. The following year, he was appointed Director of Pathology at the Rainhill Mental Hospital near Liverpool, where he spent 13 years undertaking what his obituarist, John Fulton, described as epoch-making studies of the cortex by the almost incredible task of cutting serial sections of each of 25 brains and staining his sections alternately for cells and fibers. His psychoarchitectonic maps of the cerebral cortex, shown here, have largely stood the test of time, and he is regarded as one of the founders of the discipline. The following year, however, he returned to Sydney to practice as a neurologist. Although he was subsequently published in many clinical papers on neurological and psychiatric disorders that he encountered in practice, Campbell had little time for more systematic research. For all his achievements, he was a diffident private person, devoted to his family and happiest in his garden in Rose Bay. He is commemorated by ANS in the form of the A.W. Campbell Award for the best postdoctoral contribution. My next pioneer, Raymond Dart, is someone with whom I had a close personal connection. Raymond Dart was born in Brisbane in 1893 and died in Johannesburg in 1988. From 1910, he undertook a biology master's degree at the University of Queensland. 4 years later, he became a medical student at the University of Sydney, where Wilson recruited him to help organise a congress of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which was holding its meeting for the first time out of the UK in Sydney. At the Congress, Wilson caused a sensation by exhibiting the oldest human fossil to have been discovered in Australia, the Talgai skull. The Talgai skull had been found by a farmer close to Dart's Queensland country home, but had lain unexamined in Wilson's museum for nearly 30 years, a fact which Wilson conveniently neglected to mention when presenting it at the Congress. Eventually, as its features suggested, the skull turned out to be, on radiocarbon dating, relatively modern at about 10,000 years, but by then Dart was hooked on paleo-neuroanthropology. When war broke out during the Congress, all the delegates promptly decamped by ship back to England. Dart followed them in 1918 at the conclusion of the war and joined Elliot Smith at University College London, where for the next 6 years he honed his comparative neuroanatomy skills, including a spell at the Rockefeller Institute in New York. In 1924, Dart was dispatched by Elliot Smith, as he did all his protégés, to become the Professor of Anatomy at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where he found an anatomy department in total disarray. He immediately emulated Wilson by establishing an anatomical museum, and to help furnish it, Dart sent his students out fossil hunting with, as we shall see, serendipitous results. This is Dart's final class of Bachelor of Medical Science students in 1956, and here am I in the middle of the back row. Like our predecessors, we also went on many fossil hunting expeditions, but none of our finds were as sensational as the fossil found on that very first student expedition in 1924 in a limestone quarry called Taung. The Taung fossil consisted of the frontal bones of a juvenile hominid and a limestone endocranial cast of its brain. As you can see, the endocranial cast, which is dark, fits snugly into the facial bones. The position of the foramen magnum indicates that this creature had a bipedal upright posture, and the vertical brow and face and the dentition are more human-like than ape-like. In his autobiography, Dart wrote that after he had extracted the fossil from the limestone breccia by using his wife's knitting needles as chisels, I stood holding the brain cast as greedily as any miser hugs his gold, my mind racing ahead. Here, I was certain, was one of the most significant finds ever made in the history of anthropology. In 1988, I visited Dart in Johannesburg shortly before his death. There, I too had a personal epiphany when I was briefly allowed to hold the Taung fossils. I swear an electric shock ran up my arms when I was cradling my millions of years old ancestor. A shock of a different kind ran through the anthropology world when Dart published his paper in Nature entitled Australopithecus africanus, the man-ape of South Africa. In it, Dart suggested that the Taung fossil was evidence that humans had evolved in Africa several million years ago from upright bipedal Australopithecines. Here is Dart with the jaw and the frontal bones and the endocranial cast and his Nature paper, which was selected, incidentally, by the editors of Nature as one of the 100 most significant papers that Nature had ever published in its preceding centenary. At the time, however, Dart was derided and mocked by the anthropological establishment because they thought they had already identified the so-called missing link between man and ape, and that link was the Piltdown fossil, which consisted of a cranium and jaw fragments. Shown here, the Piltdown skull, with white plaster filling in the missing bits, had a large brain capacity, a prognathous jaw, robust dentition, all of which were characteristics diametrically opposed to those of the juvenile Taung fossil. This famous painting depicts Sir Arthur Keith, doyen of the British anthropology establishment, examining the Piltdown skull. Behind him, on his left, is the discoverer of the skull, the Reverend Charles Dawson. Next to him, on his left, is Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, FRS, keeper of the fossils at the British Museum no less, who authenticated the Piltdown fossils. On Keith's immediate right is our old friend Sir Grafton Elliot Smith, always in the thick of it, pointing to a skull feature. But looking down from his portrait on the wall is Charles Darwin, disapprovingly, because he had predicted that human origins lay not in Europe, but in Africa. 30 years later, the Piltdown fossils were proved to be fake, being composed of a modern ape jaw, stained to resemble a fossil, and assembled with a relatively modern human skull. In retrospect, this painting resembles an Agatha Christie-like gathering of the suspects in a drawing room. There were plenty of suspects, including Sherlock Holmes's creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who lived nearby to Piltdown and had the requisite forensic skills. However, the perpetrators of the hoax have never been positively identified. Subsequent findings have confirmed Dart's intuition that the genus Homo evolved from the genus Australopithecines that roamed upright in the African savanna 3 to 4 million years ago. Dart also postulated that it was upright posture with the consequent freeing of the hands for more complex manipulation that was a driver in the expansion of the human cerebral cortex. I remember Dart as a charismatic man with a resonant voice that struck terror into medical students in the dissecting hall by bemoaning the fact that millions of years of evolution had produced such clumsy manual dissectors. But I also remember him as a kindly man who first engendered my own interest in neuroscience. My last pioneer, John Eccles, left Australia in 1967, the year I arrived, so we never met. John Eccles, or Jack as he was called by those close to him, was born in Melbourne in 1903 and died in Switzerland in 1997. In 1925, after qualifying in medicine at Melbourne University, he won a Rhodes Scholarship to Magdalen College, Oxford. There, he undertook a D.Phil with Sir Charles Sherrington, who was to win the Nobel Prize in 1932 for his classical studies on reflex circuits in the spine. Here is Eccles seen visiting Sherrington later in his retirement home. While in Oxford, Eccles became convinced that synaptic transmission in the central nervous system was not chemical, as had been established in the peripheral nervous system, but was electrical. This provoked the famous synaptic transmission controversy, with Eccles leading the electrical Sparks camp that opposed the chemical Soup camp led by Sir Henry Dale. In 1937, with war looming, Eccles returned to Australia as director of the Kanematsu Institute in Sydney, where he was joined by Bernard Katz and Stephen Kuffler, both Nazi refugees. Here are the trio in Macquarie Street, with Kuffler on the left, Eccles in the centre, and Katz on the right. Together they constituted probably the most distinguished medical science team ever to work in Australia. Both Katz and Eccles were to win separate Nobel Prizes, and Kuffler was probably only denied one by his early death. However, they remained unknown at the Kanematsu Institute, where, to quote a contemporary, the three inhabitants of the fourth floor worked irregular hours, dressed unconventionally, and were doing important and clever things that to the rest of the Institute staff seemed all too abstruse. In 1944, Eccles moved to New Zealand as Professor of Physiology at the University of Otago, where he remained for nearly 8 years, further developing the technique of intracellular recording from vertebral spinal neurons. The first report was published in 1951 in the Proceedings of the Otago Medical School, and a contemporary recalled getting a letter from the United States asking, "What's going on in Dunedin? Suddenly, everyone wants the Proceedings of the Otago Medical School." In 1952, Eccles joined the John Curtin School of Medical Research at the Australian National University, where he remained for 14 years, a period he referred to later as his golden research years. Here he was to undertake his famous experiment demonstrating that the hyperpolarizing IPSPs accompanying spinal motor inhibition could not be explained electrically, and therefore CNS neurotransmission must be mediated chemically, as in the periphery. As Sir Henry Dale put it, a remarkable conversion indeed. One is reminded almost inevitably of Saul on his way to Damascus, when sudden light shone and the scales fell from his eyes. In 1963, rewarding his courage,
Eccles won the Nobel Prize by refuting his own most cherished hypothesis. In 1966, at the age of 65, he was forced into retirement by the ANU, and he departed in high dudgeon, where he set up laboratories in America, first in Chicago and then in Buffalo. But these were neither happy nor especially productive years. And in 1975 he retired to Switzerland, where he wrote several books and articles on the relationship between mind and brain. Eccles was a philosophical dualist who believed in a separation of mind and brain, even speculating that supernatural forces mediated the connection between the two. This is but one of his many books, co-written with the Austrian philosopher Karl Popper, called The Self and Its Brain. Eccles was greatly influenced by Popper, whom he'd met in New Zealand, where Popper had taken refuge from the Nazis. It was Popper's assertion that refutation was a fundamental process in science that had given Eccles the courage to refute his own hypothesis about electrical synaptic transmission. What was Eccles like as a person? He was said to possess extraordinary powers of motivation and stamina, and an exceptional ability to create productive research teams. But he could also be, to quote one of his former students, irascible. That concludes this brief tribute to some of the Australian neuroscience pioneers who preceded the establishment of the Australian Neuroscience Society in 1980, but the list is far from complete. In addition to Foster, Wilson, Campbell, Elliot Smith, Raymond Dart, and John Eccles, there were others also worthy of mention. Perhaps I can do so on a future occasion. They included Archie McIntyre, Peter Bishop, Paul Corner, David Curtis, Jeffrey Bernstock, and Molly Holman, all of them, sadly, whom I knew but are now deceased.
Historians like to believe that those generations who know no history have neither a past nor a comprehensible future. But as an amateur historian, I'm only too aware of how malleable history can be. As Winston Churchill put it with inimitable chutzpah, I think history will be kind to me because I intend to write it myself.